This podcast was produced by OAR FM Dunedin with support from New Zealand On Air.
Kia ora, assalamu alaikum. Welcome to another episode of Headscarves and Good Yarns. This episode, we're going to be talking about K-pop. Now, let me tell you something about K-pop. I've been a fan for a long time. I think it was like towards the end of my high school years that I got into K-pop. BTS just wasn't even a thing. Big Bang was probably the biggest group at the time, and even after all this time, I'm still just gagging it with the K-pop. I absolutely love it. So it's been so cool seeing how big it keeps getting over the years. But there is, like everything else with the show, it is really that deep. There is always something to talk about and analyze here, and that's exactly what I want to do with the K-pop world. Like, even if you're not a big fan of K-pop, you're watching a performance and the choreography is next level. Like, I don't know like anywhere else in the pop scene where like people are dancing to the level that K-pop idols are. It's insane. It's so amazing to watch. Like, every member hits it, every count exactly on time, like, and so in sync, especially Twice. Shout out to Twice. They're so in sync. It's like they move as one, and it is so impressive to watch. And you just know that, you know, people are training for years and years to get to that level. Years and years to get to that level. It's so impressive. And as I'm talking about this, there's this one particular song that is jumping to mind, and it's the Standing Next to You with Jungkook and from BTS, and Usher is in it as well. Both are really amazing performers, really impressive dancers. And it's interesting because a lot of K-pop is influenced by, you know, street culture, black culture, and I'm not going to be, you know, carving out time on this podcast or on this show trying to make that argument that it does, because it most definitely does. But I want to talk about what the cost of that is, and you know, what else we should be unpacking because of that fact. But anyways, it's really interesting when K-pop kind of meets the world that they have borrowed from, you know, the hip-hop, R&B, street dance culture. And like, you especially see it when Usher and Jungkook are dancing next to each other. And there is a difference between the two, and it's definitely not skill, because, you know, Jungkook is an amazing dancer and so is Usher. But there is something else that is different, and I think that gap comes from you know, the culture versus like borrowing from that culture, which is insane. Because, and I think that gap between Jungkook and Usher's dancing is the reason why I wanted to do this episode. Because if you think about it, right now, K-pop is one of the biggest cultural exports. It's massive, especially since, you know, BTS has really taken off to another level. You know, it's worth billions of dollars. There's hundreds of millions of fans in pretty much every country across the world. It's insane, the diversity of the K-pop fandom group. And, you know, a lot of K-pop sound and movement, the dance, is borrowed from Black American music and street culture. You know, the rapping, the dancing, the vocabulary, the fashion. And one thing about the K-pop industry is like they're pretty like forward about that, you know. It's not a fact that's hidden, which is why I'm saying I'm not going to you know, talk about whether or not ahhing and umming about whether it is or not. It is, and it is quite obvious. But that gap between borrowing something and understanding it, I think is really what I want to get into, especially because I feel like when it comes to the cultural appropriation korero, there have been so many things that have been said and done, but I feel like we need like a richer understanding of it, because yes, if someone does, for example, if someone does blackface now, I think most of us understand why that isn't okay. But there are so many ways that we don't talk about cultural appropriation. Like, it's not to say that you can, some things are just no-go, like blackface, heck no. But, there is a way of talking about cultural appropriation and cultural appreciation, and I think if kind of diving into K-pop is a really good way of exploring that, because there is something that happens in the space between borrowing something and understanding it, because sometimes that borrowing is done really thoughtfully with real credit and real relationships behind it, but sometimes it's just not the same. It's slapped on for aesthetic, there's no history attached, and sometimes that's done in a way that is genuinely offensive, slurs and lyrics and blackface and stuff like that. But I think what I want to talk about today is what cultural appropriation actually means, kind of talk about some specific examples from K-pop, and because K-pop has just become so big, I think that changes the stakes about all of this. And then kind of the bigger question about, what's actually lost artistically and ethically when you take a look of a culture without the life behind it. And I think actually that word life, that's a really good example. That's a really good word to kind of describe that difference between Jungkook and Usher's dancing. Not to say that Jungkook danced terribly. An amazing dancer, technically amazing, but I think that heart and the soul, that's what Usher has. And I think that's just what happens when you borrow from a culture but don't really understand the history behind it. It's like that color and that context is not quite there, even though technically yes, and the skills, yes, but like that life, I think that's what's missing, that soul. So let's get into it. Before we get into it, I think some vocabulary is important. That will be quite grounding for our conversation. And, cultural appropriation is a word that's kind of used a lot. And I think it's happened so much to the point it's kind of lost its precision. So I think just simple basic working definition is, when someone from a more dominant or more powerful group takes something from a marginalized culture, whether it be a style or a sound or a word or a symbol, without understanding it, without giving credit, and without any kind of relationship or kind of give and take with the community that it belongs to. And, often that thing gets stripped of what it originally meant. And so often what happens with cultural appropriation is the group or the community or the person or whatever doing the taking gets to profit from it or look cool for it, while the community or the people that came from it are still being punished for the exact same thing. And I think that last part is really the heart of cultural appropriation. Because, this conversation is relevant at some points. It's not so much about who's allowed to wear what. It kind of re-puts the focus back on, it's about who pays a price for it and who doesn't. So, when a Black American shows up for a job interview with locks or cornrows, for decades faced real documented discrimination, passed over jobs, sent home from work, hit with, grooming rules. But, that same hairstyle on a non-black person gets called edgy, or it's a look or a concept. But the hairstyle is the exact same. What's changed is who's allowed to wear it without consequence. And I think that's just the whole other layer of appropriation that we just don't talk about a lot. It's not just about borrowing. It's about borrowing without none of the risk being attached to it. Because I think when it comes to cultural appropriation, the kōrero kind of starts and ends with who isn't allowed to wear it. And yes, I'm not saying that conversation isn't relevant. It most certainly is, but it's also deeper than that as well. And I think the way that we talk about cultural appropriation, it's kind of easy to forget that. And I think another really important nuance here is that not all cultural borrowing is theft. Music, especially in particular, I think it's relevant if we're talking about K-pop. It's always been a hybrid migratory thing. Like jazz moved from New Orleans to through Chicago, through Paris, and then it came back and changed. And rock and roll is inseparable from Chuck Berry and Little Richard, filtered through to British art students. Reggae shaped punk. Hip hop itself is a hybrid of the Jamaican sound system culture and Black American oral tradition and funk. And so nothing is really pure in that sense, pure with air quotes. So I think, what's important here isn't borrowing versus not borrowing. I think that's the wrong framing of cultural appropriation, but it's appropriation versus appreciation versus citation. So Crystal S. Anderson is a professor who studies Black culture and its global influence, and she wrote this amazing, most in-depth academic book on this exact topic. It's called Soul to Soul: African American Popular Music and K-pop. You see what she did there with the Soul to Soul? She actually kind of pushes back on appropriation being the only word we should use here. Homegirl makes a really good argument that a lot of what K-pop does with Black music is not appropriation, but better described as citation. So, meaning a deliberate, intentional nod to tradition, the same way a jazz musician quotes other jazz musicians, or the way hip-hop has always built on sampling other people's work on purpose, as kind of a tribute. So, in her view, when K-pop artists study R&B vocal runs or hip-hop's rhythm and phrasing, and they credit it, engage with it, and build real ongoing relationships with it, sometimes literally working directly with Black musicians and choreographers, that's taking part in a global music tradition, not stealing from it. And, I think that's an important counterweight, and we're going to sit with it in this kōrero today, because this episode is not meant to be K-pop is bad, but it's a lot more interesting and nuanced and more uncomfortable than that. And I think the truth is that K-pop contains both things simultaneously, which is genuine, well-credited citation that exists alongside the kind of extractive, sometimes outright racist appropriation, and often happens within the same artist's career, or sometimes in the same music video. And so I think this is what I want to introduce for the rest of our kōrero. So citation slash appreciation, which is knowing the source, crediting it, engaging with the people and history behind it, and ideally building reciprocal relationships. But appropriation is taking the aesthetic, whether it's the hairstyle, the slang, the dance, the flavor, while discarding the history, the struggle, and the communities who are still living inside the consequences of that history. And I think, keeping that distinction is going to be hella important. And I think, I just want to establish something very clearly, because I think it kind of undercuts the defense that says, this is just Korean culture. Why are you making this about race? And I think we need to be really clear here that K-pop as an industry and a sound was built by design on top of African American popular music. And it's not a hot take. It is founding history. When Lee Soo-man created SM Entertainment in 1995, goddamn, that makes it 30 years ago, and, kind of effectively invented the modern K-pop system. He modeled it explicitly on American R&B and hip-hop music and the Motown factory system, which is scouting, training, choreographing, and then packaging young performers like the way Berry Gordy's Detroit operation had done decades earlier. JYP's founder, Park Jin-young, JY Park, built his own career and sound directly out of American R&B and New Jack Swing. So I think it's worth pausing on that uncomfortable detail we'll come back to later. JY Park, one of the 3 men who literally built the modern K-pop industry, performed in blackface with his backup dancers early in his career, and later on a variety show told a singer that she sounded like Mary J. Blige and called Blige a thug. This is coming from the man who imported the sound. Imported some of the era's worst instincts about the people who created it too. So from day one, the core sound of K-pop, the vocal runs and the rap verses and the trap style production and the dance vocabulary built on hip-hop and house and street dance forms is African American in origin. And I know it sounds like a controversial statement, but it's accurate musical history. So it's actually, and then I hear you asking, what's up with debate? What are we actually talking about here, Amal? And it's what happens in the gap between borrowing the sound and understanding the culture that made the sound. And so I kind of want to bring in, receipts here. Receipts kind of makes it sound like this is tea and gossip. That's not what I want to do. Hold up. I just want to go through some specific examples. And you know what? If you're a K-pop listener and I'm talking about one of your favorite groups or your bias or whatever, I'm not coming for them personally. Trust. I also love K-pop as well, but it's really important that we keep it a buck and keep it 100 about these things, because how else are we going to critically analyze, critically think about this, and then therefore engage with the world differently if we don't keep it real. I'm not trying to come for people's sake for the sake of it. But I do want to go through some examples, and we're kind of going to go in chronological order, just to show that this has been happening, okay? Of, documented incidents. So let's start in 2003. We had the Bubble Sisters, and I think this is one of the earliest and most blatant examples. Girl group literally performed in blackface for their debut album cover and promotional photos, and it wasn't just a stage bit, it was like their actual public facing debut imagery. And then we're going to fast forward just about 9 years to G-Dragon. Big Bang's G-Dragon posted an Instagram photo in what appeared to be blackface in the same year Trayvon Martin was killed. At the time, his representatives called it a huge misunderstanding and said the image was taken out of context. But this is not the first time that he had done blackface either. He'd done it before in a video presented as a tribute to Andre 3000. Ooh, child. Also in the same year, we had Tiara. So they had their video for Ya Ya Ya. They put the group in stereotypical feathered Native American headdress imagery. So, different community, but that same kind of extractive logic, which is sacred or historically loaded imagery reduced to a look. 2017, we had Mamamoo. And I think this one's a really big one because the group's reaction to this kind of became a template for how apologies can work. So it was that iconic, but in a bad way. During a Seoul concert, a video segment aired of the members in dark face paint styled as Bruno Mars and his band for a parody. I don't know why I said that as if I was shocked. I knew this, but I think honestly it still gags me just a little bit. And his band for a parody of Uptown Funk. Ugh. Backlash was immediate and international as well. Like, people was talking about it. So, and I think that's why it was iconic in a bad way. So Mamamoo posted an apology pretty quick, within roughly a day, and they wrote, we are extremely ignorant of blackface and do not understand the implications of our actions. There is no excuse for what we did. And you know what? Actually, on face value, that's a relatively good faith apology by industry standards. There was no, if anyone was offended, there was no deflection, and I think this is but it was there was more to it, and I think there's another important complication. Mamamoo's Hwasa was separately criticised on other occasions for performing lyrics containing the N-word and for wearing a do-rag during a different Uptown Funk performance. And so I think, it was a good apology, don't get me wrong, the surface of things, but it doesn't erase a pattern. It just tells us that a group is capable of hearing the criticism when it lands, I think. But yeah, still a pattern. And then kind of in that 2018, 2019 era of K-pop, there was a lot of choreographing and styling choices across so many groups. Zico, EXO's Kai, and Big Bang's Taeyang were all criticized at different points for wearing dreadlocks or braids in music videos and promotional material. Those are hairstyles that carry deep historical significance, and that black performers have professionally and socially been penalized for wearing, and it was worn here purely as a look with no acknowledgement of origin. Also in 2019, we had the Stray Kids criticized for cornrows and promotional images, and the reaction from some parts of the fandom actually pushed towards a more constructive outcome. So after a fan used a video call opportunity to directly raise black fans' concerns of the group, members responded with an public acknowledgement, which fans at the time said that was more than most groups had offered. 2020, a tease, similar thing, criticized for cornrows during comeback promotion for Thanks. Their agency, KQ Entertainment, they did issue an apology pretty quickly, within 24 hours. And I think, again, that's notable because of its speed and directness of the response doesn't come around a lot. And then in 2020, 2021, the song Stay Tonight by Changha was criticized for appropriating South Asian, specifically Indian imagery and aesthetics. And so I think this is a really important example, because this reminds us that, this conversation isn't just about black culture, even though black culture is where K-pop borrows the most heavily and most consistently. I think an ongoing thing is kind of hard to pin to a single clip or moment or song, but just like the blaccent, it's just so persistent. It's like when idols switch, whether it be in interviews or ad-libs or rap verses, into the speech patterns of African American vernacular English, the dialect of English spoken by many Black American communities, which has its own grammar and slang and rhythm, and so using it occasionally inside a song isn't unusual, because I feel like plenty of genres do that, but it's definitely a pattern when it kind of becomes a costume that idols put on and off at will. Sometimes it's even being framed as a fun talent, watch me talk like a black person with zero actual connection to black communities or their history. 2021, we've already spoken about J.Y. Park. The very founder that we talked about earlier posted a remix of Kendrick Lamar's DNA, which drew lots of criticism for pairing the song with imagery of non-black performers in afros and dreadlocks. Again, he's been doing this. This is 30 years of this. Kind of similar with the hairstyles. But in 2023, 2024, Lisa and Jenny from Blackpink repeatedly were, in box braids and cornrows across music videos and across the Idol. And so fans raised the same question of what's up with the styling choices, the zero acknowledgement of the hairstyle's cultural history or the people who are still disciplined professionally and socially for wearing them. Probably one of the most recent examples was last year, Kiss of Life, a live stream themed around old school hip hop vibes, featured members in cornrows and bantu knots, gold chains, mimicked African American vernacular English and stereotyped gestures. One member rapping another artist's explicit lyrics and picking up the nickname Lil Taco Bell. Another stacking hats in what read to viewers as a cartoonish parody of hip-hop fashion rather than, paying homage. And I think what made this example particularly sting is that a message later surfaced showing a member privately asking fans not to leave the fandom after watching it. Which kind of is evidence that the group already suspected before it aired that the content would be seen as offensive and still went ahead regardless. And so they lost over 200,000 followers within days. And the apology when it did come, just came across as too slow and too late. And last year also, a member from Baby Monster, an old video resurfaced reportedly from before her debut, appearing to show her using the N-word during a school performance. And, kind of what drew the criticism here wasn't the clip itself, but also the inconsistency. The same label previously disciplined another trainee for a similar incident, but kind of stayed silent here, which is just interesting. And kind of underneath all of these examples as well is the testimony of a handful of black idols who have actually been signed by Korean agencies. Alex Reid, an American who debuted with the group PB Rania in 2015, has spoken about being asked to do her own hair and makeup when the styling team wasn't equipped for it, being styled differently from her group mates, getting less stage time. And I think it's a small detail, but it captures the whole double standard, is being criticized for wearing a hanbok, which is the traditional Korean clothing, as though a black performer adopting Korean tradition were somehow, presumptuous in a way that a Korean performer adopting Black American style apparently isn't. And I think a caveat, because fairness does matter here, several of these incidences were followed by real apologies, and a few agencies visibly shortened their response over the decade, which maybe suggests some institutional learning is happening, even if it's uneven. But I think something that hopefully will come to in this korero is that because there are better examples and they're worth studying specifically for what they do differently. And I think, the reason why it's really important to talk about this is that this is K-pop is not minor. K-pop's overseas exports, is worth 1.24 trillion won, which is about 893 million, and that was back in 2023 alone, and I'm sure it's increased now. It is huge. There is fan surveys that have put fandom numbers as high as 200 to 225 million people worldwide, and so there's so many people engaging with K-pop. So, if we sit with that for a second, this is not just a subculture doing cosplay in the corner of the internet. This is one of the most successful cultural export machines on the planet, generating tens of billions of dollars, built substantially on a musical tradition created by Black Americans under conditions of exclusion, segregation, and systemic underpayment for the same creative labor. And so when the industry gets the citation half of that equation wrong, extracting the aesthetic while erasing or mishandling the people or communities and the history behind it, it's just not a small thing that we can ignore that's happening at a small scale. It's happening in front of hundreds and millions of people, generating billions of dollars and shaping how a global generation, many of whom will never directly encounter Black American culture in any other way, understands what the culture even is. And so in that case, the stakes shift, a blaccent and a 500 view fan cam is a footnote, but a blaccent normalized across a genre watched by 250 million people is a transmission mechanism. It teaches the aesthetic of a culture to the world while quietly stripping out the substance. And K-pop is so accessible now, which is awesome, but it also means it's often the first and sometimes the only point of contact many international fans have with anything resembling hip-hop or R&B culture. And so the industry, whether it intends to or not, is in the business of defining blackness for people who have no other reference point to check against it. And, it's not even really it doesn't have anything to do with intentions or not. This just happens by design. And so there is a really important quote, which I think really sets the tone for this whole corridor. And the quote comes from Herbert Reed, a British art critic, poet, and philosopher. And this quote comes from his book, To the Hell with Culture. You cannot impose a culture from the top. It must come from under. It grows out of the soil, out of the people, and out of their daily life and work. It is a spontaneous expression of their joy, of life, of their joy and work. And if this does not exist, the culture will not exist. Joy is a spiritual quality, an impalpable quality that too cannot be forced. It must be an inevitable state of mind, born of the elementary process of life, a byproduct of natural human growth. And I think this quote really just speaks to everything. And so what this quote is saying is that joy is a quality of spirit, not technique, and you cannot manufacture it on demand. And I think that's sorry, I feel like I'm really dragging Jungkook here, but it's just honestly such a good example. If we think back to the difference between Usher and Jungkook dancing, it kind of speaks to that, right? Like the life or the soul, it's a quality of spirit, and it's not something that cannot be manufactured. And I think that's what Usher has. And when Reed wrote this quote, it was more about art and society broadly, arguing against the idea that culture can be manufactured top down by institutions or states or committees, and really insisted that real culture is something that grows organically out of a community or a person's actual conditions of living. But I think if we apply that quote to this lens here, hip-hop dance, the breaking and the popping and the locking and just the general swagger of it, and the whole vocabulary that K-pop choreography draws from constantly, it didn't start in a studio. It started in the Bronx at block parties, in circles at parks and rec centres, as a direct response to the actual conditions people were living in. A neighbourhood the city had abandoned economically, a soundtrack of funk and beats, communities building joy and competition and identity out of almost nothing, and in the real physical place and time that it happened. That's, something extra you sometimes feel from a performer steeped in that world, even when they're barely moving. It's just that magic sauce. And it's not, something isn't some mysterious trait you're either born with or not. And it's not about race in some kind of like fixed biological sense. It's more what Reid was describing. It's movement that grew out of daily life, work and struggle and joy, rather than movement that got handed down to a body from a choreographer. However brilliantly that body can execute, this is the actual answer to the question I raised earlier. What's really missing in those moments, it isn't skill, it's soil. So, and also this is not a claim to say that only black, dancers can move well. That's not the case. I mean, I've met some black people who just straight up don't even have rhythm. Even a little side step, 1 2 1 2 is a little bit too much. So I'm not here to say that, and I'm not here to say that training doesn't matter, or that non-black performers can never really get inside these dance forms. Plenty of non-black dancers who've spent years actually living inside, hip-hop's social competitive dance battle culture generally do get it, because they've put in that mahi to get under that soil. And that's the work that Reid is talking about, right? And so what I'm trying to say is that K-pop's idol training system is that top-down model that Reid was talking about. Trainees spend so many years in the company, in this boot camp style training, learning the choreography to a T. Okay, it's an industrial pipeline. But this pipeline was deliberately modeled on old Motown factory systems. So it's built on purpose to produce incredible, technically amazing dancers who are consistent at a massive scale. But what it's not built to do, and structurally struggles to do, is pass down the soil, which being the community, the history of struggle and joy that a form like hip-hop or R&B or, gospel singing actually came from. So, when an amazing, very extremely talented idol executes choreography with total precision, but something still reads as missing when steeped in that source culture, that's exactly the distinction that Reid made in action. It's the difference between a culture's form, which can be studied and drilled and replicated with enough hours and discipline, and a culture's root, which by definition cannot be imposed from the top, cannot be manufactured on a in a training room or on a schedule, and it cannot be faked no matter how many mirrors you rehearse in front of. And this is also the vocabulary that Sida Bo Seiji, a scholar who has spent almost 20 years studying K-pop, uses when she critiques K-pop's relationship to its own traditional Korean culture, not just borrowed black culture. Her research, on K-pop's use of hanbok, pansori, and traditional Korean aesthetic elements makes exactly the same points in Reid did, but in reverse. She argues that K-pop, the appearance of tradition, continues to be more important than tradition itself. And I think that's a damning and useful line, because it tells us that this isn't only a story about race. It's a structural feature of how the industry relates to any culture, including its own. So K-pop, by design, is a machine for producing the appearance of authenticity at maximum technical polish. And so whether the thing that's being surfaced is Korean shamanic imagery or Bronx breaking vocabulary, the process is the same. Extract the recognizable form, deploy it for its spectacle and differentiation, and move on to the next concept before the roots even have time to grow. And so, Crystal Anderson's more optimistic citation framework and Reid's soil idea, they actually aren't in conflict. they're describing two ends of the same spectrum. An artist who studies a tradition for years, credits it explicitly, builds real relationships with the people who carry it, and then let that study show up in sustained careful practice, that's citation. And it can generally put down roots even in an imported form. An artist who is handed the aesthetic before a comeback or told to execute, that's imposition from the top, and no amount of individual talent can fully compensate for what that process leaves out. And so, what's actually lost here? What is the real cost? And I think let's name this cost plainly, because it's just aesthetics. It's not serious enough. It's not deep enough. The first cost is erasure of authorship. When a hairstyle or a dance move, a vocal technique or a slang term gets picked up by a K-pop act with no acknowledgement, the audience, which, may I need to remind you again, hundreds of millions of them, many with no other point of contact of the source culture, walks away without knowing where it came from. And I think there's a case here that's really important to note. The Ysault, the French black artist who performed at the 2024 Paris Olympics, publicly accused K-pop producers of recreating her music video shot for shot without credit, saying, in her words, kind of paraphrased, that the industry has been extracting black creative labor for decades while erasing the names behind it. Whether you take her specific allegation as proof of a broader pattern she's naming, the unattributed lifting of black creative work is exactly what repeat critics of the industry have documented for so long. The second cost here is the double standard and consequence, which I think, I already said before, but it's kind of worth restating as a cost and not just as an observation. Black performers inside and outside Korea continue to face real discrimination for the same choices that kind of read as edgy or cool on non-black idols. Like every unattributed cornrow moment in a K-pop music video happens in a world where a black student can still be sent home from school for the same hairstyle. And I think those two facts are connected, not just coincidental. Another cost here is that the art form itself gets thinner. And it's as much about the art as it is about the ethics. When a dance style gets pulled out of the community and the history it came from and reduced to a set of steps drilled for stage formations, something in the form itself gets lost. You still get extraordinary precision. Oh my gosh. Genuinely, K-pop choreography is some of the most demanding stage choreography in the commercial pop music anywhere in the world. But you also sometimes get a hollow virtuosity, movement that's flawless to watch and technically beyond criticism, but emotionally empty, because the why behind the movement, which is the joy, the struggle, the community that Reed is describing, never got passed down along with the how. I think another cost here is the burden shifted onto black idols and black fans. Every time an incident happens, it's disproportionately black fans and the handful of black idols in the industry who absorb the emotional labor of explaining why it's harmful, while at the same time facing accusations from parts of the fandom that they're overreacting or policing culture. Alex Reed's account of being treated differently within her own group or being penalized for embracing Korean culture while her fellow group mates were rewarded for performing black culture is the clearest illustration of who actually bears the cost of an industry that hasn't built the infrastructure to get this right. And the last cost that I can think of here, and this one cuts towards the industry's own long-term interest, credibility and goodwill. K-pop wants and needs continued access to the massive, engaged, majority non-Korean global audience that we have quantified earlier, and a meaningful share of that audience is black or is deeply invested in hip-hop and R&B as art forms with real histories. And so every unaddressed incident or every single time the pattern is reaffirmed, chips at trust with exactly the audience the industry is trying to keep. The Kiss of Life case, losing 200,000 followers in days isn't just a PR story. It's kind of an indicator what happens when an audience decides an industry is taking their culture without taking their concerns seriously. Which I think is, really interesting. The last thing that I want to focus on here is like who's doing it differently, because I don't want to end this kōrero on just pure criticism, because the more useful and more interesting story is some artists do this better than others, and it's worth getting specific about what they do differently, because it kind of will help us all understand the difference between citation versus appropriation versus appreciation. And I think BTS, not to say that they're perfect, but they probably have the most positive examples. If I think back to their choreography for Idol, they used a move called the Gwara Gwara, which is a dance that came out of South Africa's house and house club scenes. They didn't just lift the move, they repeatedly and publicly said where it came from in interviews when they were asked, instead of letting people just assume it was generic African-inspired flavor. And also, another example, J-Hope had a collaboration with Becky G for his song Chicken Noodle Soup. And it was a song originally by Webster and Young B, which who are associated with Harlem's dance culture. They had there was direct acknowledgement of the original artist and a detailed creative back and forth with Becky G, who had grown up with the original track, rather than just not acknowledging at all. During the 2020 Black Lives Matter protests, several K-pop fandoms, most visibly BTS Army, because that's what the fandom is called, organised to match $1 million donation the group made to BLM-related organisations, raising the equivalent amount within about a day, redirecting a hashtag flooding tactic used by some of the fans of that movement into direct financial support instead. And so, of course, this doesn't erase the industry's appropriation problems, and it should not be read as some kind of debt paid off. But I think it is a really good example of a fandom and a group using the platform this industry built to put resources back into the community where the culture it draws from, rather than just extracting from it. And, the pattern that separates these cases from, the incidences that we talked about before isn't talent, because every artist we've discussed today is enormously talented. It's the process. Did the credit happen? Did the relationship with the source community happen? Was there research and acknowledgement built into the creative processes from the start? Or was the aesthetic simply reached for off a mood board because it was cool or edgy or street in a way that will sell? And I think that's the entire distinction, and it's a distinction that any agency, any choreographer, any artist could choose to build into their process. It costs them nothing but attention. So where does that leave us? Because K-pop is not going anywhere. K-pop is not going to stop, drawing on Black American music and street culture, because, as we've established at the start, that borrowing isn't an add-on to K-pop. It's foundational to what K-pop is as a sound and a movement vocabulary. The question was never, should this borrowing stop? The honest question is whether an industry generating tens of billions of dollars a year, watched by 250 million people worldwide, is willing to do the much harder and less glamorous work of turning extraction into citation, crediting sources, building real relationships with the communities and artists this music comes from, training idols in the history alongside the choreography, and treating accountability as a routine practice rather than crisis management triggered only when a clip goes viral. But I think here's the thing that Herbert Reed's line ultimately points us toward, and I think it's the right note to end on. Culture that only comes from the top, designed, drilled, deployed for maximum commercial push, can absolutely dazzle you. And I'm dazzled. I love K-pop. K-pop choreography can be some of the most breathtaking commercial dance on the planet. And none of what, I said today in today's corridor erases that. But the soil that Reed is describing, the joy, the struggle, the daily life a form actually grows out of, that part can't be imposed by a training program, however good. It can only be learned slowly by actually going to the source, crediting it, and letting the relationship change you. Some K-pop artists are doing exactly that work, and many still aren't. And the difference between those two paths is a difference between a global industry that participates honestly in the tradition it draws from, and one that just keeps mining or mimicking them. And I think this whole getting to the soil, if you are getting to the soil with anything that you do, you're not going to cross that line into appropriation. And I think that's the thing about cultural appropriation, is that it's that top down. It's because the sacred, tapu value of the culture, whether it be fashion or vernacular or whatever it may be, it's been extracted to the point where it's cool or it's profitable, and there's no engagement with the soil in that case. And so I really think it is important that when we do talk about appropriation and appreciation, that distinction between mimicking, copying, extracting versus getting to the soil is made. And I think that's the part that's really missing when we do talk about cultural appropriation, getting to the soil, but also like when you do get to that soil level and you're forming those relationships and you're forming that connection, it also changes you as well. You're learning something, you're growing something, you're appreciating something. Your positionality has changed because you're seeing things differently. And I think that's also another really important part to acknowledge as well. Appropriation doesn't change you because you're just taking. And it's really important that when you do get to that soil level, you're allowing yourself to be changed and to be challenged. But thank you for joining into this episode of Headscarves and Good Yarns, and we'll catch you for the next one.
Thank you for tuning in into another episode of Headscarves and Good Yarns. To keep spinning the yarns, let us know your thoughts. You can find us on Facebook and Instagram at Headscarves and Good Yarns, or email us at headscarvesandgoodyarn@gmail.com.
This podcast was produced by OAR FM Dunedin with support from New Zealand On Air.